A warehouse near Cairo, summer 1941. Inside, thousands of machine guns sat in wooden crates. Every one of them cleaned, every one of them oiled, every one of them wrapped in waxed paper and stamped with a single word: obsolete. The Royal Air Force had thrown them away. The engineers who designed them had moved on. The war outside the warehouse doors in the Libyan desert was going badly for the British, and the men fighting it had no idea that the weapons they needed most were sleeping in the dark a few miles from their headquarters. 1 year later, one of those forgotten guns would help destroy 37 German aircraft in 15 minutes. One of them would ride into occupied France on a jeep behind enemy lines. One of them would end the war being carried by a solicitor from Northern Ireland who had likely killed more enemy aircraft on the ground than any Allied fighter pilot killed in the air. This is the story of the gun that nobody wanted. The gun that the Special Air Service turned into a legend. And of the men brilliant, tired and mortal who took it back out of the dark. That summer in the same city, a young officer had lain in a hospital bed writing on a scrap of paper. He was 25 years old. His back was partially paralyzed. His name was David Sterling. And though he did not know it yet, he was about to change what those crates meant. But to understand what he did, we have to go back further. Back to a quiet drawing office in the north of England. Back to the men who built the gun in the first place. Back to the beginning. In the early 1930s, aircraft design was moving faster than the men who armed them could keep up. The old world of the biplane was ending. Fabric wings, wooden struts, an observer with a rifle standing in an open cockpit, all of it was being replaced. Metal skins, enclosed canopies, machines that flew twice as fast as anything before. For a rear gunner on a British bomber, this created a mathematical problem. If an enemy fighter came screaming past your position at 300 miles an hour, you had at most half a second to hit it. A standard infantry machine gun cycled at 300 rounds a minute. By the time the bolt traveled forward, fired and cycled back, the target was already gone. The gunner had aimed at empty sky. The engineers at Vickers Armstrong understood this. They were a British firm with a long pedigree in weaponry. They had built the Vickers heavy machine gun that served through the trenches of the First World War. They had built the Vickers Berthier, the light machine gun, adopted by the Indian Army in 1932. They knew every mechanism, every spring, every locking geometry. And they saw the problem clearly. The bomber gunner needed a storm. Not a stream of fire, a storm. They took the Vickers Berthier as their starting point. It was reliable, it was well made, but it was heavy and it was slow because it had been built for infantrymen firing from fixed positions. That would not do. The engineers began stripping mass out of the mechanism. Lighter bolt carriers, finer tolerances, a gas system tuned to cycle harder and faster than any infantry weapon would ever need. The key was the locking geometry. Unlike the Bren gun, which locked its breech early in the cycle, the Vickers Berthier locked at the very last moment before firing. This late locking meant the moving parts could travel faster in both directions, without tearing themselves apart. The engineers exploited it. They pushed the design until the numbers became almost unreasonable. 900 rounds a minute, then 1100, then 1200, faster than the German MG-34. Faster than anything the Germans, Italians or Americans were building. They called it the Vickers gas-operated or Vickers Geo. In official British ordnance documents, it appeared as Class K. To the men who would eventually carry it, it became known simply as the Vickers K. It fired the standard point, 303 British cartridge. It fed from a flat round pan magazine that sat cleanly on top of the receiver, holding up to 100 rounds. Though gunners usually loaded only 96 or 97 to ensure smooth feeding. The barrel had radial cooling fins machined into the steel. The whole weapon was compact, air-cooled, and built for one purpose: to turn a half-second of aim into a wall of lead. When the Vickers K went to trial in the mid-1930s against the American Browning machine gun, it won. It was more reliable. It cycled faster. The Royal Air Force adopted it for flexible defensive positions across the bomber fleet. It rode in the turret of the Bristol Blenheim, in the nose of the Handley Page Hampden, in the dorsal position of the Armstrong Whitworth Whitley, in the observer seat of the Ferry Battle. in the biplane cockpits of the Fleet Air Arm Swordfish Albacore Barracuda for the last dark years of the pre-war world. For a brief window, the Vickers K was the gun that guarded Britain's bombers. Then the war came, and everything the engineers had built the gun for began to disappear. The Battle of Britain was fought in the skies of southern England in the summer of 1940. It was won not by bombers but by fighters, Spitfires, Hurricanes, aircraft that carried no gunner, aircraft where the pilot was the weapon aiming his machine by aiming himself. The armament of these fighters was fixed, rows of machine guns bolted into the wings firing straight forward, aimed by pointing the entire aircraft at the target. The gun that mattered was one that could be packed tightly into a wing bay and fed by a long belt of ammunition that never had to be changed in the middle of a fight. The Vickers K could not do this. Its wide exposed drum magazine sat on top of the receiver like a dinner plate. It was designed for a man to swap by hand in a turret. In a fighter wing, it was useless. There was no room. The Browning machine gun belt fed and compact took its place. Here is the twist that history rarely mentions. The Vickers K did not fail. It was not defeated. It was not outdesigned by a better weapon. The trials it had won in the 1930s were still valid. The rate of fire was still extraordinary. The reliability was still there. What killed the Vickers K was the shape of the airplanes around it. Aircraft design had moved on. The open flexible gun position, the whole role for which the Vickers K had been built, was becoming obsolete. Turrets were being replaced by fixed-wing armament, and a gun designed for turrets no matter how good had nowhere to go. By 1940, the Royal Air Force was pulling the Vickers K out of service across its main combat fleet. The Fleet Air Arm held on to it longer because slow maritime patrol aircraft still needed a man behind a gun. But for the RAF proper, the decision had been made. Clean the guns, grease the mechanisms, wrap them in waxed paper, pack them in crates, ship them to depots, stamp them surplus to requirements. Excellent engineering, excellent workmanship, excellent guns, and nobody wanted them. Cairo, July 1941. The city was hot, crowded, and nervous. The German general Erwin Rommel had arrived in North Africa 4 months earlier, and his Africa Corps was already pushing the British back across Libya. The Desert War was tilting the wrong way. In headquarters, staff officers argued over maps. In hospitals, wounded men filled the wards. In one of those wards, a very tall young man sat propped up in bed with a scrap of paper on his lap. David Sterling was 6 feet 5 inches, 25 years old. A lieutenant in the Scots Guards, seconded to No. 8 Commando, part of a raiding force called Lay Force that had been sent to the Middle East and then mostly disbanded. His back was partially paralyzed. His legs would not work properly. He could not walk without crutches. He had not been wounded in battle. He had injured himself performing an unauthorized parachute jump. There was no proper training. There was no proper equipment. He had simply decided he wanted to see whether parachuting into the desert was feasible, and he had gone up in a borrowed aircraft with a borrowed parachute, and he had fallen too fast and hit the ground too hard, and now he lay in a bed in Cairo trying to move his toes. He was furious, not about the injury, about the wasted time. While he lay there he thought about what the British Army was doing wrong. He thought about the long thin supply lines that stretched from Tripoli to the front. He thought about the airfields along the coast packed with German and Italian aircraft. He thought about how those airfields were defended against battalions, against divisions, against the great slow weight of conventional attack. He thought about how they were not defended against something small, something fast, something that came in the dark. 5 men, 6 men, a handful of soldiers moving in silence, striking targets that no one had prepared for. He began to write. By the time he was released from the hospital, he had the outline of an idea and a problem. The idea was raiding. The problem was the British Army. Any request through normal channels would take months. Committees would meet, papers would be filed, objections would be raised. The idea would die on someone's desk. Sterling knew this, so he did not use normal channels. He hobbled on his crutches to Middle East headquarters in Cairo. He got past the perimeter guard by looking as if he belonged there. He climbed the fence. He walked in. He found the office of Lieutenant General Neil Ritchie, the 44-year-old deputy chief of the General Staff, and he handed Richie the notes he had written in the hospital. Richie read them. 3 days later, Sterling was back with a formal pass, and he was standing in front of the commander-in-chief of the entire Middle East Theater General, Sir Claude Auchinleck, aged 57, a soldier of long experience who had heard many young officers propose many things. Auchinleck listened. Then he approved. Sterling was promoted to captain. He was authorized to recruit 6 officers and 60 other ranks. The new unit was given a name that sounded deliberately like something much larger than it was. L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade. Here is a twist that most tellings of this story leave out. There was no brigade. There had never been a brigade. There was no special air service. The name was pure deception invented to make Axis intelligence believe that the British had built a large organized airborne force in the Middle East. In reality, Sterling had a handful of men. A small camp at Kabrit, on the Suez Canal, some borrowed equipment, and an idea that had never been tested. The brigade was a lie. The lie was the point. He recruited quickly. He needed a technical mind, and he found one in Jock Lewis. John Steele Lewis was 27, an Oxford graduate born in Australia, a lieutenant in the Welsh Guards. He was quiet, methodical, and obsessed with problems that other officers dismissed as too small to matter. Lewis had already been working on something in his spare time. A small explosive charge designed specifically to destroy parked aircraft. A mixture of plastic explosive thermite and motor oil all packed into a Hessian bag the size of a fist. Placed on a wing over the fuel tank, it would ignite the fuel and burn the aircraft to a wreck. They called it the Lewis bomb. He needed a combat officer, and he found one in Paddy, Maine. Robert Blair Maine was 26, a solicitor from Newtown Ards in Northern Ireland, an international rugby player who had toured South Africa with the British and Irish Lions in 1938. He was enormous. He was quiet. He was by every account a man of controlled and dangerous temper. When Sterling recruited him, Maine was, according to the standard accounts drawn from later regimental memory, under close arrest. He had reportedly struck a superior officer. The details vary between sources, and no formal court-martial record survives to confirm the story exactly. What is certain is that Maine was available, that he was a natural fighter, and that Sterling brought him in. There were others. A slowly gathering handful of men, most of them from the disbanded lay force, most of them looking for something to do with a war that had so far given them very little. They set up camp at Kabrit near the Great Bitter Lake on the Suez Canal. They had almost nothing. They stole tents from a New Zealand camp down the road on their first night because the army had failed to supply them. They begged parachutes from a supply officer who was not sure he was allowed to give them any. They trained on aircraft frames borrowed from a nearby airfield. Nobody yet had thought about the Vickers K. The guns were still in their crates in their warehouse in the dark. They would wait a little longer. The desert stretched west from Kabrit for 1,000 miles. Somewhere out there in Libya, along that coastal strip, where the Africa Corps and the Italian army had built their airfields, were the targets Sterling had imagined in his hospital bed. He looked at them on his maps at night. He measured distances. He calculated fuel and water. He listened to the men who had been in the desert before, who told him about the wind, about the sand, about the way a compass could lie to you when the ground held too much iron. He began to plan a raid. He did not know it yet, but the plan he was making would fail. It would fail badly. It would nearly finish him. It would kill men he had personally recruited and personally trained. It would leave him standing in the wreckage of his own idea, with the army asking whether L Detachment should be disbanded before it had accomplished anything at all. But it would also teach him one thing. Parachutes were the wrong tool. There was another way to reach the airfields. A way through the desert itself on wheels, guided by men who understood the sand better than anyone. And when Sterling learned that lesson, and when he found the vehicles to carry his men, he would still need one more thing. He would need firepower. He would need a weapon that could pour a wall of lead across a defended airfield, in the 2 or 3 seconds before the defenders even understood what was happening. He would need something reliable enough to fire in a sandstorm, something light enough to bolt onto a jeep, something with a magazine that would not jam. He would need a gun that nobody else wanted. He would need a gun that was at that very moment still sleeping in a warehouse near Cairo. waiting for a war that had already forgotten it. And when he found it, the desert would learn what 1200 rounds a minute sounds like in the dark. The night of the 16th of November 1941, the wind came out of the south. It was not the ordinary wind of the coast. It was the deep desert wind, the one that lifts sand into the sky and drops the temperature and turns the horizon into a wall of nothing. In meteorological reports, the officers called it a Hamsin. In the barracks at Kabrit, the men called it worse. At the airfield at Bagush, 5 Bristol Bombay transport aircraft sat on the tarmac with their engines running. Inside each aircraft, a group of men waited in the cold red light of the interior lamps. Parachutes on their backs. Weapon containers strapped to the fuselage. Faces streaked with camouflage grease. 55 men in total. The first operational mission of L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade. The plan was called Operation Squatter. They were going to parachute into the desert behind the German and Italian lines. They were going to walk for a day. They were going to reach 5-axis airfields at Timimi and Gazala on the coast of Libya. They were going to place Lewis bombs on parked aircraft. They were going to destroy the German fighter force before General Auchinleck launched his ground offensive. Operation Crusader 48 hours later. That was the plan. The wind ate the plan before the aircraft left the ground. The Royal Air Force meteorologists warned against jumping. Winds at the drop zone were reported at 30 knots and rising. In 1941, with the equipment available, jumping into winds above 15 knots was considered dangerous. Above 25, it was suicidal. Sterling knew this. He also knew that Auchinleck's offensive would not wait for the weather. If Squatter did not go tonight, it would not go at all. And if it did not go at all, a detachment might not survive the political scrutiny that would follow. He made the decision. They flew. The aircraft climbed into a black sky that was not black at all, but a moving howling curtain of dust. The pilots tried to navigate by dead reckoning. The lights on the ground were invisible. The drop zones marked in advance by patrols from the long-range desert group were somewhere below in the storm. At the drop point, the men jumped. They went out into a wind that no parachute of that era could handle. Some men were pulled sideways at 40 miles an hour and dragged along the ground until they could cut their harnesses free. Some hit rocks, some hit ridges, some were killed on impact. The weapon containers, which held the Lewis bombs, the fuses, the water, the food were scattered across dozens of square miles of desert. Of 55 men who jumped, only 21 or 22 made it back alive. The exact number varies between the accounts of survivors and the official regimental history. Not a single Axis aircraft was destroyed. Not a single bomb was placed. The Lewis bombs were lost with the containers, and the men without explosives and without water walked for days across the desert, trying to reach the rendezvous points where the long-range desert group was waiting. Most did not reach them. Sterling himself made it back. He was gaunt. He was sunburned. He was carrying the knowledge that half his unit was dead or captured on their first operation. Middle East headquarters wanted L Detachment disbanded. The idea had failed. The men had died. The airfields were untouched. The whole audacious concept, small teams, deep penetration, disproportionate damage appeared to have proved exactly the opposite of what Sterling had promised General Auchinleck in the summer. Here is the first twist that mattered. Jock Lewis was still alive. The technical mind, the engineer of the Lewis bomb. The man Sterling could not replace. Not for another 6 weeks. The men who saved the survivors of Operation Squatter were not paratroopers. They were the Long-Range Desert Group, a small specialist unit of navigators and mechanics who had been operating deep behind Axis lines since the summer of 1940. They drove Chevrolet trucks that they had modified themselves. Sand tires, condenser radiators, extra fuel tanks, sun compasses mounted where the windshields used to be. They knew the desert the way a sailor knows the sea. They could navigate by stars. They could read the shape of a dune and know how it would blow in the next hour. They could drive for 1,000 miles across ground where no road had ever existed and arrive within 100 yards of the point they had aimed for. They picked up the survivors of Squatter and drove them back to a rendezvous at Siwa Oasis. On the drive, Sterling talked to them. He asked how they navigated. He asked what their trucks could carry. He asked how close they could get to an Axis airfield without being detected. The answers he received changed the entire concept of L detachment. The parachute was the wrong tool. The desert itself, if you understood it, was a highway. Sterling proposed a partnership. The long-range desert group would drive his men to the target. The men would go in on foot from a distance, place their Lewis bombs, and be picked up again in the same trucks. No parachutes, no storms, just the desert and men who knew how to move through it. The long-range desert group agreed. 6 weeks after Operation Squatter, on the night of the 14th of December 1941, small teams of L detachment attacked separate Axis airfields on the Libyan coast. Sterling's team went for Sirte. It failed. Sterling later described walking in the darkness past a sleeping Italian soldier before an alarm was raised. He got no bombs onto aircraft. Paddy Mayne went to Tamet. 1 week later, on the night of the 21st of December, Bill Fraser's team hit Agedabia. His after-action report claimed 37 aircraft destroyed. Tamet was an Italian coastal airfield in Libya. It held the Caproni CR-309's Fiat CR, 42 biplane fighters, and a scattering of transport aircraft. It had a small mess building for the pilots and ground crew, lit by paraffin lamps and warmed by a stove against the December cold. Mayne and 4 men walked in from the desert at around 11 p.m. He heard voices from the mess, laughter, a gramophone. He walked to the door. He opened it. According to Malcolm James Pleydell's memoir, Born of the Desert, published in 1945. Pleydell was the SAS medical officer who spoke with the men afterward. Mayne stepped into the room, took in the scene, and opened fire with a Colt automatic. The details of the next 30 seconds have been repeated many times in many books by many writers who were not there. What Pleydell recorded and what the after-action report contained was that the mess was cleared and that Mayne and his team then went out onto the airfield and placed Lewis bombs on the parked aircraft. The men were said in later regimental accounts to have destroyed 14 aircraft that night along with a fuel dump and a stack of bombs. There is a story often repeated that when Mayne ran out of bombs but found one more aircraft, he tore the instrument panel out of the cockpit with his bare hands. The story comes from Mayne's own men. It was passed down through the regiment. It is possible. It is characteristic. But it is not in the strict historical sense independently verified. What is verified is the count. 14 aircraft on the first proper operational success of L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade. The unit had not failed. The idea had worked. Auchinleck did not disband them. Just over 2 weeks later, on the night of the 30th of December 1941, Jock Lewis was in a small column of vehicles making its way back from a raid on Ophelia airfield. The raid itself had been modest, a handful of aircraft destroyed. The withdrawal across open desert was the dangerous part. Just after dawn, on the 31st of December, enemy aircraft found them. The type of aircraft is recorded in different sources as either Messerschmitt Bf-110S of the Luftwaffe or Italian Fiat CR. 42 fighters, the sources disagree. They came down low over the desert machine guns firing and they hit the LRDG trucks in the open. Lewis was riding in one of the trucks. He was shot in the thigh. The wound was serious. There was no cover. There was no medical facility. The vehicles kept moving, trying to reach broken ground, where the aircraft could not follow, but Lewis bled out on the truck bed as they drove. He was 28 years old. He had built the bomb that made the raids possible. He had trained the men who would use it for the rest of the war. He had quietly and without any personal ambition been the engineer of the entire concept. He died 6 weeks after Tamet on a truck in the desert, at the beginning of a year that would change everything about the way small units fought. Sterling wrote later that Lewis's death was the worst single loss L Detachment ever suffered. Here is the twist that history rarely dwells on. The long-range desert group men, whose names most Americans have never heard, is the reason the Special Air Service exists at all. Not the parachutes, not the audacity, not the celebrity that Sterling would later attract. The LRDG saved the survivors of Squatter, taught Sterling how to reach the airfields, and drove the men who did the actual killing. Without the LRDG, there would have been no SAS beyond one bad night in a sandstorm. The men who taught the legend how to work were nearly forgotten by the story that legend became. Through the first months of 1942, the raids continued. Maine had already returned to Tamet for a second visit on the night of the 27th of December, 1941, 3 days before Lewis was killed. His report claimed 27 more aircraft. Other airfields fell in sequence. Nofilia Berca Barce Benina. In 8 months, L Detachment and the LRDG together were credited with the destruction of over 90 Axis aircraft on the ground. The number is large. It is also, like every SAS number, a claim from British reports rather than a figure verified by Axis records. Some historians accept it in full. Others, including the modern British historian Gavin Mortimer, note that the German and Italian loss returns for the same period are lower, and that the true figure lies somewhere between the two. What is not in dispute is the effect. The Axis command in North Africa began to respond. Airfields that had been guarded by a board sentry at a gate were now surrounded by wire floodlights, machine gun positions, and mobile reserves. Sentries were posted next to individual aircraft. Perimeter patrols were doubled. The German command sent out orders that any small British raiding force detected in the desert was to be pursued and destroyed with all available resources. The airfields were no longer sleeping when the SAS arrived. Here is the twist that changed everything. The success of L Detachment was killing L Detachment. Every raid made the next one harder. Every burned aircraft made the enemy more careful. The technique that Sterling had built the unit around, walking in, silently placing bombs, walking out, was becoming impossible. By the spring of 1942, the men were beginning to lose their edge. Maine carried out a raid at Berca in March, in which he was nearly caught. Fraser lost men at Bars. The pattern was clear. Sterling understood it, and his response was characteristic. If they could no longer sneak onto an airfield, they would drive onto it. At full speed, with so much firepower that the defenders would not have time to organize before the raid was over. Speed and shock. But he needed vehicles, and he needed guns. In the summer of 1942, the American Willys Jeep began to arrive with the British 8th Army in Egypt. It was a small square four-wheel drive vehicle designed for battlefield reconnaissance. 2 men could lift it out of soft sand. It had a top speed of about 60 miles an hour on hard ground. It ran on any grade of petrol. It could be maintained in the field, with almost no tools. Sterling saw it. He requisitioned as many as he could. At Kabrit, the mechanics stripped them down to the frame. Windscreens removed to lower the silhouette. Doors and hoods discarded. Extra fuel cans and water condensers bolted to every available surface. Bracing added to support the weight of what would be mounted on the front and rear pintles. Then Sterling faced the last question. What guns? The men needed firepower that could suppress an entire airfield perimeter in the first 5 seconds of an attack. Not accuracy. Not sustained fire, a wall of lead in the dark that would make the defenders flinch and lose their aim. Vickers Berthiers were too heavy. Brents fired too slowly. Twin Vickers medium guns were too bulky. American .50 calibers were beautiful weapons, but they were rare and reserved for anti-aircraft use. Some wonder records do not preserve his name. Mention the crates in the depot. The old aircraft guns. The ones the RAF had put away in 1940. The Vickers K. Sterling went to look. He walked into the warehouse. The crates were still stacked. The waxed paper was still intact. He had one opened. The gun that came out was compact, air-cooled, and beautifully machined. He had it taken to Kabrit for testing. When they fired it in the training area, the men who watched described the effect as unlike anything they had used before. 1,200 rounds a minute. A single burst emptied a 96-round pan in 5 seconds. The tracer rounds loaded every third or fourth position in the drum, drew visible arcs through the dusk that could be walked directly onto a target. The pan magazine, the one thing that had killed the gun's future in fighter wings, turned out to be a virtue in the desert. It could not be fouled by wind-blown sand the way a belt could. It sat cleanly on top of the receiver. A trained gunner could swap a pan in the dark in under 6 seconds. The gas system engineered for the extreme cold and constant vibration of high-altitude bombers handled the heat and grit of the Sahara without complaint. The gun that the Royal Air Force had declared obsolete was for the specific task. Sterling now needed a weapon for the best gun in the British inventory. Here is the twist. The Vickers K was not chosen because it was the last option available. It was chosen because, when it was tested against every alternative, it was the finest weapon for the job. The rate of fire, the reliability in sand, the magazine, the compact mount, the tracer, the engineering that had once made it the pride of the RRAF bomber fleet, turned out in a role its designers had never imagined to be exactly what a raiding jeep needed. The men at Vickers Armstrongs in their quiet drawing offices 10 years before had built better than they knew. Sterling standardized the configuration. Each jeep received a twin Vickers K mount on the front pintle, controlled by the front seat passenger. A twin Vickers K mount was fitted on the rear pintle for the driver's mate. 4 guns per jeep, 4,800 rounds a minute per vehicle. On a column of 18 jeeps, if every gun fired at once, the combined rate was over 80,000 rounds a minute. The tracer served two purposes. It let the gunner walk his fire onto target in the dark. And when a tracer round hit an aircraft's fuel tank or wing root, it did not simply puncture the aircraft. It set it on fire. They practiced in the desert north of Kabrit through the summer of 1942. Sterling drilled an arrowhead formation. The lead jeep at the point. 2 columns of jeeps trailing behind on either flank. Every gun laid in a fixed arc so that when the formation swept through a target, an airfield, a fuel dump, a marshalling yard, the fields of fire overlapped. No gap, no pause, no moment when a defender could raise his head and organize. They fired at night in the moonlight into empty desert. Malcolm Playdell, watching one of the practice runs, wrote in his memoir that the volume of tracer coming off the jeeps was so intense that the desert around them lit up as if the sun had come back. The men were quiet on the drive back to camp. They knew without anyone saying it that what they had built was not just another raiding technique. It was something new. A weapon system that did not exist in any army's field manual. A doctrine of small teams, moving fast, delivering a hurricane of fire and vanishing back into the dark before the enemy understood what had hit them. They knew too that they had one target in mind for it. An airfield in Egypt, 200 miles behind the German lines, packed with the transport aircraft that were keeping Rommel's army supplied at Alamein. The name of the airfield was Sidi Hanesh. They did not talk about it much, but every man at Kabrit that summer, tightening a bolt on a pintle mount loading a pan of 303 tracer wiping sand off a gas piston, was thinking about the same thing. The desert had taught them how to move. The long-range desert group had taught them how to navigate. The Willys Jeep had given them speed, and a warehouse full of forgotten guns had given them the fire. Sidi Hanish was waiting. The night of the 26th of July 1942 was 3 weeks away. The night of the 26th of July 1942 was clear. Above the Egyptian desert, the sky held a thin crescent moon, and a scatter of stars that had not changed since the men who watched them were boys. On the ground at a hidden position roughly 40 miles south of the coast, 18 jeeps sat in a loose line under camouflage netting. Their engines were cold. Their guns were loaded. Their crews were checking every strap, every water can, every pan of ammunition for the third and fourth time. 44 men in total. Some of them were veterans of Squatter. Some had been at Tamet with Maine. Some had joined L Detachment only in the spring replacements for the dead. They wore Arab headcloths against the dust. Their faces were burnt dark by 8 months of sun. They spoke in low voices or not at all. At the head of the column stood David Sterling. He was 26 years old now, taller than any man around him, thinner than he had been the year before. He carried the operation in his head, the route, the timing, the fallback rendezvous, the emergency signals. Beside him was the man who would get them there. His name was Willis Michael Sadler. Everyone called him Mike. He was 29 years old. Before the war, he had worked on a farm in southern Rhodesia. He had joined the long-range desert group in 1941 and had discovered almost by accident that he possessed a mind that could hold the geometry of the desert, the way another man might hold the layout of his own kitchen. He was, by the summer of 1942, one of the finest desert navigators in any army in the world. He was going to lead them to Sidi Hanish, across 50 miles of open desert, in the dark, without headlights, without a road, without a landmark visible on the horizon. He had a sun compass mounted on the jeep. He had a wristwatch. He had the stars. That was all he needed. The target was an axis-forward airfield near the town of Fuka on the coast west of Alexandria. It was in the summer of 1942, one of the most important airfields in the entire theater. It handled Junkers Ju-52 transports, the three-engine workhorses that flew fuel, ammunition, and replacement personnel from Crete and Greece across the Mediterranean to Rommel's Panzerarmee Africa at the Alamein line. It held Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers. It held Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. If the SAS could destroy the transports on the ground, they would not simply damage the airfield. They would strangle the supply of a German army that was at that very moment 30 miles from the last British defensive line before the Suez Canal. The stakes were not tactical, they were strategic. Sterling knew this. Every man in every jeep that night knew this. They had spent 3 weeks preparing. The Vickers K guns had been stripped cleaned and reassembled 3 times each. Pans of ammunition had been loaded with a specific mix of bolt tracer and ammo-piercing rounds designed to punch through aircraft skin and ignite the fuel behind it. Each jeep carried 24 pan magazines, roughly 2,300 rounds per gun. At last light, Sadler took a bearing. The engine started. The 18 jeeps rolled out of the desert camp in a long single-file headlights off moving on the pale ground under the stars. For 4 hours they drove. Sadler navigated by dead reckoning, adjusting for drift, checking his compass, watching the stars wheel above him. The men in the jeeps behind him watched the shape of his silhouette and tried not to think about what would happen if he was wrong. If Sadler was wrong, they would arrive at empty desert. Or worse, they would arrive at the wrong airfield at the wrong time into the barrels of an alert defense. Sadler was not wrong. Just before 1 in the morning, he raised his hand. The column stopped. They were, by his reckoning, about a mile south of Sidi Hanesh. Ahead of them in the darkness they could see nothing. No lights, no sound, no shape against the sky. Sterling walked forward. He listened. He gave the order to form up. The 18 jeeps rearranged themselves in the dark, without headlights, into the arrowhead formation they had practiced through July. 2 columns of 9 jeeps, each in echelon, with Sterling's jeep at the point of the arrow. Every gun was locked at its assigned arc. Every driver knew his position in the formation to within 3 yards. They moved forward at walking pace. Then half a mile from the airfield, something happened that no plan had accounted for. The airfield lit up. Every runway light on Sidi Hanesh switched on at once. The sudden white glare turned the desert into a photograph. The parked aircraft were visible in long rows. The perimeter huts, the fuel bowsers, the anti-aircraft positions. Every detail of the target laid out under floodlights as if for inspection. For 1 second every man in every jeep believed they had been detected. That an alarm had gone up. That the runway lights were the prelude to the tracer that would tear the formation apart. Then over the low ridge to the northwest they heard the sound of a Junkers Ju-52 on approach. The airfield had not seen them. The airfield was turning on its lights to receive a scheduled Luftwaffe transport coming in to land. Here is the twist. The German ground crew had just handed David Sterling a fully illuminated target. He fired a green very flare into the sky. The engines opened up. The 18 jeeps accelerated together toward the perimeter of the airfield. Still in arrowhead formation, guns already tracking onto the rows of parked aircraft on either side of the runway. At 200 yards they crossed onto the airfield itself. At 100 yards, every Vickers K on every jeep opened fire. The airfield became a wall of sound. 72 guns cycling at 1,200 rounds a minute, each poured tracer into the parked aircraft on both sides of the arrowhead. The tracer arcs looked from the perimeter towers like solid ropes of light being flung sideways from moving vehicles. The Junkers Ju-52 on final approach saw the tracer. Its pilot pulled up. He banked hard to the north and climbed away. He did not land. On the ground, aircraft began to explode. A tracer round, striking a full fuel tank, did not simply ignite the aircraft. It detonated the fuel as vapor and the wing came apart. Then the wing next to it caught. Then the aircraft behind it. Then the fuel bowser between them. The chain of explosions spread down the flight line faster than any human being could have run alongside it. German ground crews came out of their tents and ran in every direction. Anti-aircraft positions on the perimeter opened up, firing wild across the field at movement they could not identify. Some of that fire hit their own aircraft. Some hit their own men. The confusion at Sidi Hanish that night was not confusion of the small kind. It was the confusion of an entire garrison that had no idea what was attacking it. The arrowhead swept down one side of the airfield, wheeled at the end, and swept back up the other. In the middle of the second pass, one jeep took a burst of German fire. The gunner in the front seat was killed instantly. His name was Trooper John Robson. He was 22 years old from Newcastle, England. He had joined L Detachment 3 months earlier. The jeep continued to move. The driver got it clear of the airfield and into the desert. 3 other men were wounded in the raid. 2 other jeeps were damaged badly enough to be abandoned before dawn. The engagement lasted approximately 15 minutes. Then Sterling fired a red flare, and every jeep still moving broke contact and vanished into the desert to the south, following Sadler's bearings back toward the safe rendezvous. Behind them, Sidi Hanish burned. The SAS after-action report drawn from the accounts of Sterling, Maine, and the surviving jeep commanders claimed 37 Axis aircraft destroyed at Sidi Hanish. The number is not certain. German loss returns from the summer of 1942, examined by later historians, including Gavin Mortimer, indicate a figure lower than 37, though the German records themselves are incomplete for that specific night. Some sources place the true number of aircraft destroyed at between 20 and 25. Others accept the SSAS report in full. The debate has continued for 8 decades and will probably never be fully resolved. What is not in dispute is that Sidi Hanish for a period of hours was combat ineffective as a transport airfield. Fuel dumps burned into the following morning. Ju-52 replacements had to be flown in from Greece. The supply flow to Rommel's forces at Alamein was interrupted at the moment when it could least afford to be. Here is a detail that survived in captured German communications. A garrison officer at Sidi Hanish reported to his superiors that the airfield had been attacked simultaneously by naval commandos from the sea, by paratroops from the air, and by armored vehicles from the land. The naval commandos were not there. There was no sea within 20 miles. The paratroops were not there. There had been no aircraft over the airfield. The armored vehicles were 44 men in 18 open jeeps carrying surplus aircraft machine guns that the Royal Air Force had put in a warehouse 2 years before and forgotten. The German officer had multiplied the attacking force in his own report by a factor of 10. Not because he was lying, because he genuinely could not believe that so much firepower had come from so few men. That was the force multiplier effect Sterling had spent a year trying to build. The Vickers K had made it real. The raid on Sidi Hanish is often described as the peak of Sterling's career. In one sense it was. In another sense it was the end of his war. Through the autumn of 1942, the SSAS continued its raids. Aircraft were destroyed. Supply columns were ambushed. Fuel dumps were burned. Sterling was promoted to lieutenant colonel. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. He began planning raids that would push the SAS further west into Tunisia to link up with the American forces advancing east from the Torch landings. In January of 1943, in a valley in Tunisia called the Gabes Gap, he stopped for the night. He posted no sentries. He was exhausted. His men were exhausted. They had been operating for weeks without rest. Sterling made the calculation that a single night's sleep in a defiladed position was worth the small risk of a chance encounter. He was wrong. Just before dawn, a German unit trained in counter-raid operations came over the ridge above the valley. Sterling woke to a German rifle pointed at his face. He was 27 years old. He would spend the next 2.5 years in Axis prisoner of war camps, including a period at Colditz Castle, from which he attempted repeatedly to escape. Here is the twist. The Phantom Major, the officer who had built an entire doctrine around striking targets that could not defend themselves, was captured while sleeping. Not in battle, not in a firefight, not in the middle of a raid. He was taken because for one night he did not post a guard. The legend at its end was not a legend. He was a very tired young man who made a very human mistake. Command of the SAS passed to Paddy Mayne. Mayne was by every operational measure an even more destructive commander than Sterling had been. He led the unit through the rest of the North African campaign, through the invasion of Sicily and southern Italy, and in the summer of 1944 into occupied France, where the SAS operated behind German lines in support of the Normandy landings and the Allied advance across Europe. Mayne survived the war. He returned to Northern Ireland. He worked as a solicitor. He died in December of 1955, aged 40, in a car accident on a road outside Newtown Arts. He was found in the wreckage before dawn, according to local accounts, by a milkman on his early rounds. By the time he died, he had been recommended for the Victoria Cross once and denied it. He had been awarded the Distinguished Service Order 4 times, one of only a handful of British soldiers of the Second World War to have been decorated at that level so often. The National Army Museum, in its assessment of Maine's operational record, has stated that his personal count of Axis aircraft destroyed on the ground during the war likely exceeds that of any Allied fighter pilot who destroyed enemy aircraft in aerial combat. Here is the twist. The most destructive individual killer of enemy aircraft in the Second World War, by that specific metric, was likely not a pilot. He was not in the air. He never flew combat. He was a solicitor from Newtown Arts, riding in a jeep in the desert firing a machine gun the Royal Air Force had thrown away. That machine gun was the Vickers K. After the war, the Vickers K continued its unexpected second life for a little longer. It served on Royal Navy motor torpedo boats and motor gun boats until the mid-1940s, where its resistance to salt spray and its high rate of fire made it valuable for close-range defense against German E-boats in the English Channel. It served with the Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron of the 1st British Airborne Division at Arnhem in September of 1944, mounted on jeeps that fought through the streets of Oosterbeek during Operation Market Garden. It served in the Fleet Air Arm until October of 1945, when 812 Naval Air Squadron flew Fairey Barracudas from Hong Kong on anti-piracy patrols in the months immediately after the Japanese surrender. Then quietly the gun was retired. The remaining stocks went into storage. Some were sold to smaller nations. Some were scrapped. Some were retained in museum collections. Today, a small number of Vickers K guns can be seen at the Imperial War Museum, at the Tank Museum in Bovington, and in the regimental collections of the SAS and the Long Range Desert Group. The engineers who designed it, the men at Vickers Armstrongs in the early 1930s, never knew what their gun would become. They had designed it for one job: high-rate defensive fire from the open turrets of Royal Air Force bombers, in a role that would be obsolete before the Second World War was 2 years old. They could not have imagined the desert. They could not have imagined the jeep. They could not have imagined Sterling, or Maine, or Sadler, or Lewis, or the men who died at Squatter, or the men who lived at Tamet, or the man who fired the green flare at Sidi Hanish and rewrote the doctrine of special operations by driving 18 open vehicles into a lit airfield in the middle of the night. They had built the gun very, very well. That was the only reason any of it worked. There is a lesson buried in this story that most tellings do not reach for. Good engineering does not expire when its original purpose does. The qualities that made the Vickers K excellent in a bomber turret: the reliability, the rate of fire, the tolerance for extreme conditions, the compact drum feed, turned out to be exactly the qualities that a raiding force in the desert needed a decade later in a role its designers had never considered. The Royal Air Force had not been wrong to declare the gun obsolete for aircraft use. The direction of fighter design had genuinely made the flexible turret gun a dead end. The men who wrote surplus to requirements on the crates were correct within the frame of reference they were using. They were simply not the last people who would look at those crates, thousands of miles away in a Cairo hospital bed. A young officer with a partially paralyzed back was writing notes about a kind of war that did not yet exist. When he found the guns, he did not care what the labels said. He cared what they would do. They fired 1,200 rounds a minute. They did not jam, they fit on a jeep. That was the entire question. The Special Air Service that David Sterling founded in 1941 became the template for every modern special operations unit in the Western world. Delta Force, the Australian SAS, the New Zealand SAS, every doctrine of small teams, deep penetration, and disproportionate violence traces some part of its DNA back to a camp at Kabrit and a set of raids across the Libyan and Egyptian desert between 1941 and 1943. At the center of it, in the first 2 years, when the doctrine was being written not in manuals, but in tracer arcs in the desert night, was a gun. A gun that had been designed by men who never met the men who used it. A gun that had been declared obsolete before the war was 2 years old. A gun that had been stamped surplus and stacked in a warehouse and forgotten. A gun that a handful of extraordinary and mortal and imperfect soldiers had pulled back out of the crate and used to change what a small unit of men moving fast in the dark could do to an army. Somewhere in the Imperial War Museum today, one of those guns sits in a glass case. The waxed paper is long gone. The cooling fins on the barrel are still visible. The pan magazine still clicks cleanly into place the way it did when an SAS gunner slapped it home over the deserts of Libya in the summer of 1942. The card next to it explains in a few short lines what it is and what it did. Most visitors walk past. But if you know the story, if you know about Sterling in the hospital bed and Lewis bleeding out on a truck in the last hours of 1941, and Maine kicking in a door at Tamet and Sadler, steering by the stars, and Robson dying in a jeep at Sidi Hanish, and 18 vehicles firing into a lit airfield until the horizon burned, then the gun in the glass case is not just an old weapon. It is a witness to what happens when good engineering meets the right man at the right moment in the right desert, and to what a forgotten object can still become when someone takes it back out of the dark.